She found the stallion's stall empty at dawn. And that's when Cassidy Morgan knew her world was about to catch fire. The rope had been cut clean, not frayed, not broken, cut. Someone had walked into her father's ranch in the dead of night and taken Thunderfoot, the black stallion with the white blaze that ran like lightning across the Texas plains. The same horse her father had won in a card game 3 years ago. The same horse that had made the Morgan Ranch the envy of every cattleman from San Antonio to the Red River. Cassidy stood in that empty stall, her boots planted in scattered hay, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. She was 22 years old, tough as rawhide, and furious her father would blame the ranch hands. He'd dock their pay. He'd probably fire someone just to make a point. But Cassidy, she was going to find that horse herself. And she was going to make whoever took it regret the day they were born. The tracks led north. Single rider, unshod horse, wild or Indian trained. She could tell by the way the hoofprints dug into the earth, light and purposeful, not the heavy plodding of ranch stock. Whoever this was, they knew what they were doing. She saddled her bay mare, Rosie, before the sun had fully crested the horizon. She told no one. Grabbed her rifle, her canteen, a handful of jerky wrapped in cloth. Her father was still asleep, probably nursing another bottle of whiskey in his study. He'd been drinking more since her mother passed 2 winters ago. The ranch had become his obsession, his fortress, his way of proving he still mattered in a world that kept pushing him aside. Cassidy rode hard. The prairie stretched out before her like an ocean of grass, golden and endless under the morning light. She'd grown up on this land. She knew every creek, every rise, every hidden canyon where cattle liked to wander. But these tracks, they led her farther north than she'd ever ridden alone, into territory her father had warned her about, into land that belonged to the Comanche. By midday she spotted him, a lone rider on a ridge, silhouetted against the endless blue sky. And there, beside him, was Thunderfoot, blackcoat gleaming in the sun like polished obsidian. Her breath caught. Her hands tightened on the reins. She could have fired a warning shot, could have turned back and returned with a posse. But Cassidy Morgan had never been the type to wait for help. And she'd certainly never been one to back down from a fight. She urged Rosie forward, closing the distance between them. The rider turned, finally noticing her, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the grass. He was young, younger than she'd expected. Maybe her age, maybe younger. His hair was long and dark, tied back with leather cord. War paint streaked across his cheekbones, red and black, stark against his bronze skin. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple chest covering, and his body was lean and strong, built for speed and survival. He didn't run. That surprised her. Instead, he watched her approach with eyes as dark as midnight, calm, almost curious. When she was close enough to see the details of his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the paint that marked him as a warrior, she pulled Rosie to a stop and raised her rifle, aiming it square at his chest. The young warrior didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply sat atop Thunderfoot, one hand resting lightly on the stallion's neck, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it amusement? Respect? Challenge? Cassidy's voice came out harder than she felt. She demanded he return the horse. She told him she'd tracked him for hours. She warned him that stealing from the Morgan Ranch was a mistake that would cost him his life. The warrior listened. Then he smiled, not a mocking smile. Not cruel, just knowing, like he understood something she didn't. And then he did something that changed everything. He swung down from Thunderfoot's back, graceful as a cat, and stood before her on the ground. He spoke. His English was broken, accented, but clear. He told her the horse's true name. Not Thunderfoot, but something else. Something in his language that sounded like wind and thunder combined. He told her this horse had been born on Comanche land, raised by his people, sacred to his tribe, and that her father had taken him 3 summers ago when soldiers raided their camp and drove them west. This warrior, his name was Takoda, though she wouldn't learn that until later, had spent years searching for this horse. And now, he'd finally brought him home, Cassidy's rifle wavered. Just for a moment, because deep down, beneath her anger and her pride, she knew her father was capable of this. She'd heard the stories. She'd seen the way he talked about the Comanche. Like they were nothing, like their land was his for the taking. But admitting that meant admitting her whole life had been built on stolen ground. And she wasn't ready for that, so she made him an offer, a challenge. She told him if he could beat her in a race across the plains, from here to the old cottonwood tree 5 miles west, he could keep the horse. But if she won, he'd return Thunderfoot and never come near her ranch again. The warrior considered this. Then he nodded, once slow, deliberate. They lined up side by side. The sun was high now, blazing down on them both. Cassidy's heart hammered in her chest. She was a good rider, one of the best. But something in the way this warrior sat atop that stallion told her this wasn't going to be easy. And then they ran. The moment Thunderfoot launched forward, Cassidy knew she'd made a terrible mistake. That stallion moved like he was born from the wind itself. His hooves barely touched the ground. Every stride was poetry, power, pure untamed speed, and the warrior atop him. He rode like they were one creature, no saddle, no bridle, just his hands tangled in the stallion's mane and his body moving in perfect rhythm with every surge forward. Cassidy pushed Rosie as hard as she dared. Her mare was strong, reliable, bred for cattle work and long days under the sun. But this was something different. This was watching lightning try to outrun the storm. The prairie blurred around her. Wind tore at her hair, pulled it loose from the braid she'd tied that morning. Her thighs burned, her lungs screamed. But she refused to give up, because giving up meant admitting defeat, and Cassidy Morgan had never been defeated. She leaned lower over Rosie's neck, urging her forward with voice and heel. The cottonwood tree rose in the distance, ancient and gnarled, standing alone on the horizon like a sentinel. 2 miles left, then 1. But Dakota was ahead, not by much, maybe 20 yards, but enough. Enough to prove what she'd suspected from the moment she saw him on that ridge. He belonged to this land in a way she never would. He moved through it like water through stone, effortless, inevitable. The finish line came too fast. Thunderfoot crossed first, and the warrior pulled him to a stop beneath the shade of the cottonwood tree. Cassidy arrived seconds later, breathless, her face flushed with exertion and something that felt dangerously close to shame. She slid off Rosie's back, her legs trembling. The warrior was already on the ground, running his hands over Thunderfoot's neck, whispering to the stallion in his own language. Soft words, loving words. Cassidy stood there watching him. And for the first time since she'd found that empty stall this morning, she felt the weight of what she'd done. She'd challenged a man for a horse that was never hers to begin with. She'd aimed a rifle at someone who'd only been trying to reclaim what was stolen from him. The warrior looked up at her. His war paint had smudged slightly from the wind and sweat. His chest rose and fell with deep, steady breaths. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. He told her she rode well. He said her horse had heart. He said in another life, another world, they might have been friends. That word hit her harder than she expected. Friends. When was the last time someone had called her a friend? When was the last time she'd let anyone close enough to try? She asked him why he'd agreed to the race. He could have just ridden off, could have disappeared into the plains where she'd never find him. Why risk it? He smiled again, that same knowing smile, and told her he wanted to see if she had honor, if she would keep her word even when it cost her something precious. Cassidy felt her throat tighten. She nodded, once, slow, just like he had hours ago. She told him the horse was his. She wouldn't chase him anymore. She wouldn't tell her father where Thunderfoot had gone. As far as anyone at the Morgan Ranch would know, the stallion had simply vanished into the wild. But the warrior didn't leave, not yet. Instead, he did something that made her heart stop. He reached out slowly, carefully, and touched her face, just his fingertips against her cheek. His hand was warm, rough, calloused. From years of riding and fighting and surviving, he told her she had a warrior's spirit. That She reminded him of the women in his tribe, fierce and unbreakable, and then he asked her, something that made her world tilt on its axis. He asked if she would come back tomorrow to this place so they could talk. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to ride home and forget this ever happened, to bury this day deep where no one, not her father, not the ranch hands, not even herself, could dig it up again. But instead, she heard herself say yes. The warrior's smile widened. He mounted Thunderfoot in one smooth motion, and before she could change her mind, he was gone, galloping north across the prairie like a shadow fleeing the sun. Cassidy stood there for a long time, long enough for her breathing to slow, long enough for the reality of what she'd just agreed to sink in. She'd promised to meet a Comanche warrior in secret if anyone found out, if her father discovered what she'd done. But as she climbed back onto Rosie and turned toward home, she realized she didn't care. For the first time in years, maybe in her entire life, she felt alive, not like her father's daughter. Not like the tough rancher's girl who had to prove herself every single day, just alive. She rode home slowly. The sun was sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. By the time she reached the ranch, the stars were beginning to emerge, tiny pinpricks of light against the gathering darkness. Her father was waiting on the porch. She could see his silhouette against the glow of the lantern, arms crossed, jaw tight. He demanded to know where she'd been, where the horse was, why she'd ridden off without telling anyone. Cassidy lied, smoothly, easily. She told him she'd tracked the thief north but lost the trail near the river. Said the stallion was probably halfway to Mexico by now. Said there was nothing they could do. Her father cursed, threw his whiskey glass against the porch railing. But eventually, he let it go, because what else could he do? The horse was gone, and Cassidy, she was home safe. That was all that mattered. That night, lying in her bed with the window open and the night wind stirring the curtains, Cassidy stared at the ceiling and thought about tomorrow, about the cottonwood tree, about dark eyes and war paint and a smile that made her feel like the world was so much bigger than she'd ever imagined, and she knew with a certainty that terrified her that her life would never be the same. She told herself she was only going to satisfy her curiosity, that she'd meet him once, maybe twice, and then that would be the end of it. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into something she couldn't name. Every afternoon, when the sun reached its highest point and the ranch fell into its lazy midday rhythm, Cassidy would slip away. She'd tell her father she was checking the eastern fence line, or riding to the creek to look for stray calves, or any of a dozen small lies that came easier each time she told them. And every afternoon, Dakota would be waiting beneath the cottonwood tree. At first, they barely spoke. They'd sit in the shade, her on one side, him on the other, and simply exist in each other's presence. She learned the sound of his breathing, the way he'd absently run his fingers through Thunderfoot's mane, the quiet strength that radiated from him like heat from sun-warmed stone. Slowly, words came, broken at first. His English wasn't perfect, and her understanding of his world was even worse, but they found ways to communicate. Through gestures, through drawings in the dirt, through the universal language of laughter when one of them said something completely wrong, and they both knew it. He taught her things. How to read the sky for coming storms, how to move through grass without leaving a trail, how to listen, really listen, to the land around her. He told her about his tribe, about the way they followed the buffalo herds across the plains, about the stories his grandmother told around the fire, about the freedom of living without walls or fences or anyone telling you where you could and couldn't go. And she told him about her life, about her mother, who died giving birth to a son who'd only lived 3 days, about how her father had never been the same after that, about the weight of being the only child, the daughter who could never be the son her father wanted, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw her as the boss's daughter and nothing more. Dakota listened, really listened, not just to her words, but to everything she wasn't saying. And when she finally stopped talking, her throat tight and her eyes burning, With tears she refused to shed. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was rough against hers, warm, real, and in that moment, Cassidy understood something that terrified her. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This wasn't just two people from different worlds sharing stories beneath a tree. This was something deeper, something dangerous. The first time he kissed her, the sun was setting. The sky had turned that particular shade of purple that only existed for a few minutes each evening, right before darkness claimed everything. They'd been sitting closer than usual, his shoulder pressed against hers, her head resting lightly against his chest. She'd been telling him about a mare who'd foaled that morning, about how the little colt had tried to stand on shaky legs and kept falling over and over, until finally, he'd managed to stay upright. About how watching that struggle had made her think about her own life, about how many times she'd fallen, how many times she'd had to get back up. And then Dakota had turned to her. His hand had cupped her face, just like that first day, and he'd looked at her with eyes so intense she felt like he could see straight into her soul. He'd whispered something in his language, something that sounded like a prayer, and then he'd kissed her. It wasn't rough, wasn't desperate. It was soft, gentle, like he was afraid she might break, like she was something precious he'd been searching for his whole life, and finally found. When they pulled apart, Cassidy was trembling. Not from fear, from the sheer enormity of what she'd just done. She'd kissed a Comanche warrior. She'd given a piece of herself to someone her father would rather see dead than sitting at their dinner table. And she didn't regret it. Not for a single second. The weeks that followed were the happiest and most terrifying of her life. They met every day now, sometimes for hours, sometimes just long enough to touch hands and steal a kiss before she had to race back to the ranch, before anyone noticed she was gone. He brought her gifts, a feather from an eagle, a smooth stone he'd found by the river, a bracelet woven from horsehair that he tied around her wrist with fingers that shook slightly. She wore it hidden beneath her sleeve, and every time she felt it against her skin, she thought of him. She brought him things, too. Jerky from the ranch smokehouse, a knife she'd stolen from the supply shed, good steel, sharp and true. Once she brought him a book. He couldn't read English, but he'd sat with it for an hour, carefully turning the pages, studying the illustrations like they held the secrets of the universe. They made plans, impossible plans. Dreams whispered in the shade of the cottonwood tree that sounded real when it was just the two of them, but fragile as spun glass the moment she rode back to face her father. He talked about taking her to meet his people, about showing her the camp where he'd grown up, about introducing her to his mother and his sisters and the elders who remembered the old days before the soldiers came, before the treaties that weren't worth the paper they were written on. She talked about running away, about leaving the ranch and her father and everything she'd ever known, about starting a new life somewhere far from Texas, maybe California, maybe Oregon, where no one would care that she was white and he was Comanche, and their love was the kind of thing that could get them both killed. But deep down, they both knew these were just stories, beautiful lies they told themselves to make the present moment bearable. Because the truth was coming, fast and inevitable as a summer storm, and when it finally arrived, it would tear their world apart. Everything changed the day her father rode out with a hunting party. Cassidy had been at the cottonwood tree with Dakota when she'd heard the distant sound of gunfire, sharp cracks echoing across the prairie like bones breaking. Her blood had turned to ice. Dakota had heard it too. He'd stood immediately, his whole body going tense and alert. He'd told her to go now, to ride home and pretend she'd never left, to forget this place, forget him, if she wanted to stay safe. But Cassidy had grabbed his arm. She'd looked into his eyes and told him no, she wasn't leaving him. Whatever was happening, they'd face it together. He'd kissed her then, hard and desperate, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her lips before everything turned to ash. And then they'd ridden, both of them, toward the sound of violence, What they found made Cassidy's stomach revolt. A small Comanche hunting party, maybe 6 warriors, surrounded by nearly 20 men from her father's ranch and the neighboring spreads. The Comanche had been driven into a shallow ravine, their horses scattered, their options gone. Her father was at the front of the group, his rifle raised, his face twisted with rage and something that looked almost like satisfaction. He was shouting, demanding the Comanche surrender, calling them thieves and savages and worse things, words that made Cassidy want to cover her ears. And then she saw why. 3 of the ranch's cattle lay dead nearby, fresh kills. The Comanche had been hunting on land, her father claimed, land that had belonged to their people for generations before the Morgan. Ranch was even a thought. Dakota pulled Thunderfoot to a stop on the ridge above the ravine. Cassidy stopped beside him, and in that moment, with the sun beating down and death hanging in the air like the smell of gunpowder, she had to make a choice. Stay silent, or speak up. Her father saw her before she could decide. His eyes went wide. Then, furious, he shouted her name, demanded to know what she was doing here, why she wasn't at the ranch, and then his gaze shifted to Dakota beside her. The recognition was instant and terrible. Her father's face went from red to purple. He raised his rifle, not at the Comanche, in the ravine anymore, but at the young warrior, sitting calmly atop the stolen stallion. He screamed at Cassidy to get away from him, called Dakota the thief who'd taken Thunderfoot, said he was going to kill him right now and mount his head on the ranch gate as a warning to any other savages who thought they could steal from the Morgans. And that's when Cassidy did something that shattered her old life completely. She rode forward, placing herself between her father's rifle and Dakota. She told her father to lower his weapon, told him Thunderfoot had never been his to begin with, told him the truth about how he'd acquired the stallion through a raid that had killed women and children and left Dakota's people scattered. The silence that followed was deafening. Every man there, ranch hands, neighbors, even the Comanche trapped in the ravine, stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Her father's voice came out low and dangerous. He asked her how she knew this, how long she'd been meeting with this warrior, whether she understood what she'd done, not just to herself, but to the family name. Cassidy's hands shook on her reins, but her voice came out steady, clear as a church bell on Sunday morning. She told him weeks. She'd been meeting Dakota for weeks. She told him about the races they'd shared, the stories they'd exchanged, the future they'd dared to imagine together. And then, because she was her father's daughter after all, stubborn and fierce and unafraid, she told him she loved Dakota, that she'd choose him over the ranch, over the Morgan name, over everything her father had spent his life building. Her father's rifle dropped, not because he'd changed his mind, but because the shock had stolen every ounce of strength from his body. He looked at her like she was a stranger, like the daughter he'd raised had died and been replaced by something he couldn't recognize. He told her to go, voice hollow, eyes empty. He said if she rode away with that warrior, she was no longer his daughter, no longer a Morgan. She'd be dead to him, same as her mother, same as the son who'd never taken a breath. Cassidy felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart, that was still beating, still fighting, but something else. The invisible chain that had bound her to this land and this name, and this impossible expectation of being everything her father needed. She looked at Dakota. He was watching her with an expression that broke her heart, because he wasn't asking her to choose, wasn't demanding she sacrifice everything for him. He was simply waiting, ready to accept whatever decision she made. And that's what made her choice easy. She turned back to her father, told him she was sorry she couldn't be the daughter he wanted, sorry she couldn't save him from his grief and his anger and his desperate need to control everything around him. But she wasn't sorry for loving Dakota, and she wasn't going to stop. Her father raised his rifle again. For a horrible moment, Cassidy thought he might actually shoot, but instead he turned to his men, told them to let the Comanche in the ravine go, told them to ride back to the ranch and never speak of this day again. And then he looked at Cassidy one last time. His face was stone, his eyes were empty, and he said the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. He told her she was no longer welcome at the Morgan Ranch, that if she ever returned, he'd have her arrested for trespassing, that as far as he was concerned, his daughter had died the day she chose a savage over her own blood. Then he turned his horse and rode away, and every single man followed, until it was just Cassidy and Dakota on that ridge, watching her old life disappear into a cloud of dust and broken promises. Dakota took her to his people. What choice did she have? She couldn't go home, couldn't face the ranch hands or the neighboring families who'd surely heard what had happened, couldn't survive alone on the plains with winter approaching and nowhere to shelter. So she rode beside him as the sun set, heading north toward the Comanche camp. And with every mile she felt herself transforming, shedding the skin of Cassidy Morgan, rancher's daughter, tough girl who could rope a steer and break a horse and shoot straight enough to make grown men. Nervous, becoming someone new, someone she didn't quite recognize yet. The camp was smaller than she'd imagined, maybe 40 people, teepees arranged in a rough circle near a creek that cut through the prairie like a silver scar. Women working over fires, children playing in the fading light, old men sitting in the shade, their faces weathered as ancient stone. When Dakota rode in with a white woman behind him, everything stopped. The children froze mid-game. The women looked up from their cooking. The old men's eyes sharpened with something between curiosity and suspicion. Dakota spoke to them in his language, fast and urgent. Cassidy caught a few words, her name, horse father, but most of it was lost to her. She could only sit there on Rosie, acutely aware of how she must look, her clothes covered in trail dust, her hair a tangled mess, her skin pale against the bronze faces surrounding her. An older woman stepped forward. She was small but carried herself like a queen. Her hair was streaked with gray, braided with beads and feathers. Her eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian blades, studied Cassidy with an intensity that made her want to squirm. Dakota spoke to the woman in softer tones. The woman listened. Then she looked at Cassidy and spoke in surprisingly clear English. She asked if what Dakota said was true, that Cassidy had given up everything, her family, her home, her people, for him. Cassidy nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. The woman, Dakota's mother, she realized, stepped closer. Close enough that Cassidy could see the lines carved into her. Faced by years of sun and wind and grief, she told Cassidy that love was not enough, that choosing to stay with them meant accepting a life of hardship, of being hunted and driven from one place to the next, of never knowing if tomorrow would bring peace or soldiers. She asked if Cassidy was prepared for that, and Cassidy, for the first time since leaving her father on that ridge, felt completely certain. She looked this woman in the eye and told her yes, she was ready, because she'd already lost everything that mattered. Everything except the man sitting beside her on a stallion that had brought them together. The woman studied her for another long moment. Then she smiled, small and sad but real. She told Cassidy that she saw strength in her eyes, the same strength she'd seen in the women who'd survived the raids and the forced marches and the broken treaties. She said Cassidy would need that strength in the days to come. Then she welcomed her to their home. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Cassidy's life. She had to learn everything from scratch: how to set up a teepee, how to tan hides and prepare meat, how to gather roots and berries and know which plants would heal and which would kill, how to move camp when the buffalo herds shifted or when scouts spotted soldiers on the horizon. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. She made mistake after mistake, burned food, poorly stitched clothing, accidentally ruined a hide by using the wrong technique. The women watched her struggle with expressions that ranged from amusement to pity. The children giggled behind their hands when she fell while trying to dismount in the graceful way Comanche women did, but Dakota never left her side. He translated when she couldn't understand. He showed her how to hold a scraping tool. He brought her water when the sun beat down and her lips cracked from thirst. At night, when they lay together in his teepee, properly married now by Comanche tradition, though no church or courthouse would ever recognize it, he held her while she cried tears of frustration and exhaustion. And slowly, gradually, she began to adapt. She learned to read the sky like Dakota had taught her, learned the names of plants and animals in his language, learned the stories his people told about the great spirits, about the first horses, about the days when the plains stretched empty and free, and the buffalo were so numerous they darkened the earth. She learned to listen to the silence, to find peace in the spaces between words, to understand that strength wasn't about never falling, it was about getting back up again and again, until standing became as natural as breathing. And she fell in love with these people, with Dakota's mother, who taught her to weave baskets and shared stories about her son's childhood, with the children who eventually stopped giggling and started asking her to tell them about the ranch and the cattle and the strange world she'd come from, with the old men who nodded approvingly when she managed to shoot a rabbit with Dakota's bow, her aim still decent even if her technique was all wrong. But the peace couldn't last. It never did. 3 months after Cassidy joined the tribe, scouts reported movement to the south, a large group, armed, headed, straight for their camp. Dakota's face went pale. He told Cassidy to help the women. Pack, quickly. They needed to move now, before. The soldiers arrived, but Cassidy's instincts told her something different. She grabbed Dakota's arm, asked him if he'd seen the group. If he knew it was soldiers, he admitted he hadn't, only that the scouts had seen many horses, many men. And suddenly, Cassidy knew, with a certainty that made her blood run. Cold, this wasn't the army, this was her father. She told Dakota she needed to go, to ride out and meet them alone, to try one last time, to make her father understand. Dakota refused, said it was too dangerous, that her father had already disowned her, that she owed him nothing. But Cassidy kissed him, long and deep, and told him this wasn't about what she owed. It was about preventing bloodshed, about being the bridge between two worlds that were hell-bent on destroying each other. She mounted Rosie before he could argue further, and as she rode south toward her old life, toward the man who'd raised her and rejected her and maybe, just maybe still, loved her somewhere deep in his wounded heart, she prayed she wasn't about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Her father looked older. That was the first thing Cassidy noticed when she rode to meet the group of armed men gathering on the southern edge of the prairie. Just 3 months since she'd last seen him, but he'd aged years. His hair had gone completely gray. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of his rifle. His eyes, once so fierce and certain, now held something that looked dangerously close to regret. Behind him, 20 men from the Morgan Ranch and neighboring spreads, all armed, all tense, all watching her approach like she was a ghost risen from the grave they'd already dug in their minds. Cassidy pulled Rosie to a stop 20 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to run if this went wrong. Her hand rested on the rifle across her saddle, not threatening, just ready. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind whispered through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, high and lonely and fierce. Then her father's voice broke the silence, rough as gravel, broken. He asked if she was all right, if they'd hurt her, if she was being held against her will. Cassidy almost laughed. Not from humor, from the sheer absurdity of the question. She told him no. She was exactly where she wanted to be, with people who'd shown her more kindness in 3 months than she'd felt in years at the ranch. Her father flinched like she'd struck him. He told her that wasn't fair, that he'd given her everything, the ranch, the horses, a life most women would kill for. And Cassidy, voice steady, heart pounding, told him he'd given her everything except the one thing she'd needed most, the freedom to choose her own path, the right to love who she wanted, the chance to be something more than an extension of his broken dreams. Her father's rifle dropped, not all the way, just enough that she could see his hands shaking. He told her he'd come to bring her home, to fix whatever had gone wrong, to protect her from making a mistake that would destroy her future. But Cassidy shook her head. She told him she was home, that the life she'd built with Dakota's people, hard as it was, felt more real than anything she'd ever known at the ranch, and that the only mistake would be walking away from the one person who'd ever seen her as more than just a tool to rebuild what her father had lost. One of the men behind her father, a ranch hand named Dutch, who'd worked the Morgan spread for 15 years, shifted uncomfortably. He spoke up, said they weren't here to talk, they were here to settle the problem of Comanche raiders stealing cattle and threatening their livelihoods. Cassidy turned to face him directly, asked if he'd actually seen any Comanche raiding parties, if he had proof of systematic theft, or if he was just repeating the same stories white men had been telling themselves for decades to justify taking land that was never theirs to begin with. Dutch's face went red, but he couldn't answer, because the truth was there hadn't been any major raids in months. The Comanche were starving, driven to smaller and smaller parcels of land, hunting a few cattle out of desperation, not choice. Cassidy pressed her advantage. She told them all that the people in that camp weren't monsters. They were families, mothers and fathers and children, old people who remembered when the plains were free, young warriors who just wanted to survive in a world that was trying to erase them completely. She told them about Dakota's mother, who'd welcomed her despite having every reason to hate a white woman, about the children who'd taught her their language and laughed at her mistakes without cruelty, about the way they'd shared everything, even when they barely had enough, because that's what people did when they were family. And then she made them an offer, a proposition that could change everything, or get her killed. She told her father she would be the bridge. She would live between both worlds. She'd bring messages, facilitate trades, help establish boundaries that both sides could respect. She'd use her knowledge of ranch life and her growing understanding of Comanche culture to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that led to bloodshed. But it required something from him, from all of them. They had to agree to stop treating the Comanche as enemies to be eliminated, had to recognize them as people with legitimate claims to this land, had to be willing to share the prairie instead of trying to claim every last acre. Her father stared at her like she'd lost her mind. He told her it was impossible, that the other ranchers would never agree, that the government and the army had already decided the fate of the Comanche, that she was asking him to go against everything he'd built his life around. Cassidy's voice turned hard. She told him he had a choice. He could ride into that camp with his men and start a fight that would end with death on both sides, maybe even hers. Or he could take a chance on something new, something that required courage instead of violence, faith instead of fear. She told him she knew he was capable of it, because the man who'd taught her to ride, who'd shown her how to read the weather, who'd held her when her mother died, that man had been brave. That man had believed in building something better. She asked him where that man had gone, and if there was any chance, any hope he might come back. The silence that followed felt like forever. Cassidy watched her father's face, saw the war raging. Behind his eyes, pride versus love, anger versus regret, the comfortable certainty of hatred versus the terrifying possibility of change. Finally, he lowered his rifle completely, rested it across his saddle, looked at her with eyes that shimmered with something that might have been tears. He told her he'd try. He couldn't promise the other ranchers would. Listen, couldn't guarantee this would work, but he'd try. For her, because maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe there was another way. Cassidy felt something release in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but hope, fragile and precious as a newborn colt. She told him there was someone he needed to meet, someone who'd changed her life, and that if he was serious about trying to build a bridge, it started with seeing the humanity in the man she loved. Her father's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Once, slow and deliberate, Cassidy turned Rosie back toward the camp, and as she rode, with her father and his men following at a cautious distance, she sent up a silent prayer to whatever spirits watched over foolish women who dared to believe the world could be different. Takoda was waiting at the edge of camp. He'd seen them coming. The entire tribe had. Warriors stood ready with weapons. Women had gathered the children. The old men watched with faces carved from stone. But when Takoda saw Cassidy riding at the front, alive and whole, something in his posture relaxed. He walked forward to meet her, and when she slid off Rosie's back, he pulled her into his arms like he'd thought he'd never hold her again. Her father watched this, watched the way Takoda held his daughter, the way she melted into his embrace, the way they fit together like two pieces of something that had been broken and was finally whole. Cassidy pulled away from Takoda just enough to make the introductions. Her voice shook slightly. She told her father this was the man she'd chosen, the man she'd build a life with, and that if he wanted any part of her future, it started with respecting that choice. Takoda stepped forward. He didn't extend his hand. That wasn't the Comanche way. But he met her father's eyes directly, and in English, halting but clear, he told Cassidy's father that he understood a father's love for his daughter, that he would spend his life protecting her, honoring her, giving her the freedom to be who she was meant to be. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, didn't expect friendship, but he hoped for Cassidy's sake they could find a way to coexist, to build something new from the ruins of their broken worlds. Cassidy's father looked at Takoda for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. He told Takoda he still didn't understand, still didn't know if this could work, but he'd seen the way his daughter looked at this warrior, and he remembered, dimly, like a dream from another life, looking at his own wife that same way. He said maybe that was enough, for now. The tension didn't disappear completely. Trust would take time, years probably. There would be setbacks, misunderstandings, moments when old hatreds threatened to burn away everything they'd tried to build. But that day, with the sun sinking toward the horizon and two worlds standing face to face, something shifted. The warriors lowered their weapons, the ranchers dismounted from their horses, and Takoda's mother brought forward food, dried meat and bread and water to share with the men who'd come armed for war. Cassidy stood between her father and Takoda, one hand in each of theirs, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt like she could finally breathe. The road ahead would be hard, she knew that. There would be people on both sides who'd never accept what they were trying to build. Government forces that would continue pushing the Comanche toward reservations. Ranchers who'd see any compromise as weakness. Warriors who'd view peace as betrayal of their ancestors. But she also knew this. Love had brought her here. Love had transformed her from a rancher's daughter into something bigger. Love had given her the courage to stand between two worlds and refuse to choose, to insist, against all logic, that there might be room for both. That night, as stars emerged like diamonds scattered across black velvet, Cassidy sat beside Takoda outside their tipi. Her father had ridden back to the ranch with promises to return in a week, to begin the slow, painful work of building bridges instead of walls. Takoda took her hand, wove his fingers through hers, asked if she had any regrets. Cassidy thought about the life she'd left, the comfortable bed, the full meals, the security of walls and fences. She thought about everything she'd lost, her name, her inheritance, her place in the world she'd been born into. And then she looked at Dakota, at the man who'd stolen a horse and accidentally stolen her heart, at the person who'd shown her that freedom wasn't about having everything, it was about choosing what mattered. She told him no, no regrets, because she'd finally learned what it meant to be alive, to be seen, to be loved for who she was, instead of who someone needed her to be. Dakota smiled, that same smile from the first day they'd met, knowing, warm, full of promise for a future neither of them could fully predict, but both were brave enough to face. He told her they'd call her many things in the years to come. Traitor, fool, dreamer. But he'd always know the truth. She was a warrior, not the kind who fought with weapons, but the kind who fought for love, for peace, for the radical belief that enemies could become family if someone was brave enough to build the bridge. Cassidy leaned her head against his shoulder, felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, listened to the sounds of camp settling down for the night. Children's laughter, women's voices, the crackle of dying fires. This was home, not because it was easy, but because it was hers, built by choice, defended by courage, sustained by a love that refused to be contained by the boundaries others tried to draw. And as sleep finally claimed her, safe in Dakota's arms beneath a sky full of stars, Cassidy, Morgan knew she'd found what she'd been searching for her entire life. Not a place on a map, not a name in a family Bible, not the approval of people who'd never understand the path she'd chosen, but something better, something real, something worth fighting for. Freedom, love, and the courage to be exactly who she was meant to be. The cowgirl and the painted warrior, two souls from opposite worlds who dared to believe that love could bridge the impossible, that understanding could grow from conflict, that peace, real, lasting peace, started with two people refusing to be enemies. Their story would be told for generations, around campfires and dinner tables, in whispers and in songs. Some would call it a tragedy, others would call it triumph. But Cassidy and Dakota, they called it life, beautiful and hard, painful and precious, exactly as it was meant to be, and that was more than enough. Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.